For our presentation, we decided to look at the gasoline market between the years of 2010 and 2019. And for this particular presentation, it's kind of a breakdown of everything we are doing for our analysis. But we were primarily focusing on those years, and then we also decided to solidify it down to a specific number of companies to make it a little bit easier to understand. BP, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch, and Luke Oil are four major companies that are associated with the gasoline/crude oil market. In a market that basically dropping a pin can influence every decision and change everything, there is changes in the demand, the production, cost, and profitability, and that there are major changes between the years of 2010 and 19. Since there have been so many different macro events that have played a role in this industry over the short amount of time, for this particular presentation and the analysis that we're doing for the class, we decided to primarily focus on a few major events that took place. On four major events, I did include five on the presentation just so you can see other macro events that have taken place. But primarily, we're focusing on the BP oil spill in 2010, the Iraq war that ended in 2011, Congress lifting the oil export ban in 2015, and then the Texas Oil Company comeback in February of 2019, just so we have a little bit of range from different areas that we are focusing on for this presentation. I'm going to jump right into the demand for gasoline. Now, on this particular slide for the demand for gasoline, it kind of looks at for $1 for your price, you can get 800 million gallons, and that drops as we've looked at the demand and supply. So we should all be able to understand that this is just a visual representation. When looking at the demand for gasoline, there are many factors that can play a role, particularly in this market because it changes so quickly. Between the years of 2010 and 2019, the demand fluctuated in so many different ways and very dramatically. In 2010, the demand was 86.4 million gallons of crude oil a day. To the present day, the demand has increased to 100.6 million gallons per day. And this was found when researching for our presentation. The countries that use this primarily is the United States, coming in with 19.87 million gallons per day, and China is coming in second with 12.45 million gallons used per day. Europe is a little bit farther behind, but as you can see, the United States is primarily using most of that demand for gasoline and crude oil. The reason these three are the primary countries that are using gasoline is because they have more mobility, they have more cars, they have more drivers and things along those lines, and that's why the demand for gasoline/crude oil has increased over the years. Some of the world's biggest crude oil providers are BP, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch, and Luke Oil, as I said previously in the beginning of this presentation. BP's sales this past year were at $222.8 billion, and this is very strong, especially in the crude oil industry, especially in gasoline. ExxonMobil comes in with $268.9 billion in revenue this past year. And then we have Royal Dutch, who also provides a very, very high number with $265 billion in sales yearly. Luke Oil is a lot lower, and they're only at $144.17 billion in sales per year, but that still means there is an increased amount of demand for this particular product. One very interesting thing with crude oil, especially with gasoline and gas prices, because the demand for gas is so prevalent in our society and it's very needed daily, weekly, or bi-weekly, however you want to understand it. For the impact of a macro event on the gasoline market to take place, that's going to negatively impact the pricing. So that means it's going to increase the price of gas. That will take about 3 weeks to hit the actual gas stations and places that sell gasoline. However, if it's going to positively decrease the sales, so if you're going to go from $2.75 a gallon to $1.45 or whatever it is, I know that's a dramatic change, it actually takes 8 weeks if they're actually going to put that into the works. So now that we've kind of looked at the major demand and how the different oil companies help and influence the gasoline market, we're going to go right into our next section. When discussing the production of gasoline in the market, or the gasoline in general, there are four things you have to keep in mind. First, gasoline is a fuel made from crude oil and other petroleum liquids. Second, gasoline is mainly used as an engine fuel in vehicles. Third, petroleum refineries and blending facilities produce motor gasoline for sales at retail gas stations. So that would be your fuel stations. And finally, retail prices on gasoline include four main components. First, cost of crude oil. Second, refining costs and profits. Third, distribution costs and profits. Distribution and marketing costs and profits. And finally, you have to include your taxes. What's listed here are components that allow the gasoline market to grow. Gasoline sold in the U.S. is produced at a blending terminal where gasoline blend stocks, finished gasoline, and fuel ethanol are blended to produce gasoline. Sales taxes along with taxes by the government can have significant impact on the price of gasoline. Refining costs, profit, and distribution and marketing are characteristics of gasoline production, especially on oil. Next, we're going to look at the raw materials. Gasoline is a product of derived from distilling and refining petroleum. Compounds of organic lead were added to gasoline in the past years to reduce the knocking on engines, but due to environmental concerns, this is no longer common, and they took this out of being one of the major raw materials. There are other chemicals that are added to gasoline to further stabilize it and to improve its color and the smell, and this is called a sweetener. So these are the basic raw materials that are used when making gasoline. Component we're going to look at with the production of gasoline. The gasoline manufacturing process is pretty simple. It all starts with exploration, which is the process where we find the parent ingredient for gasoline, which is petroleum, as we all know. After the oil reserve is found, the area must be test drilled in order to find samples, to make sure that it tests well, to make sure this is exactly what they're looking for. Then the crude oil is recovered through wells that reach a specific distance in the rock. The oil then goes through a series of system pipes that are instilled directly into the drilling well. The pressure of the rocks bring the oil up and the oil is retrieved. The oil goes through a process called the fractional distillation, which separates the chains of the refined fuels. Once the step is done, then comes the most important step, which is refining the petroleum, also known as caloric cracking. The process which I probably am not pronouncing correctly, high temperatures and increases pressure to affect chemical change in petroleum. Once the gasoline is refined, chemicals are added, and you get, as we all know, gasoline. Gas is a mixture of two voluntary liquids, which is heptane and isooctane. We've just discussed the demand and also the production. We're going right into cost and profitability. Cost and profitability in the gasoline industry are microeconomic events that happen to the macroeconomic event that happens in the entire world. The cost for raw materials used to produce gasoline, the major component is the actual crude oil for the price of gasoline. Other costs are the distribution, marketing, retail, dealer fees, the transportation, wages, blending, taxes, government fees, insurance, wages, everything along those lines, as many of us know. Now that we've kind of looked at cost and profitability, what all really affects the cost, what is added into it, we're going to look at the actual kind of the mini breakdown to motor fuel. And so right now, your refining cost is about 8%. So that's not very high. Your transportation and retail on the gas is 18%. And then you have your taxes, which is 21%. But then we actually look at, as we've discussed, crude oil is the key component to this, which is 53% of your actual motor oil price. So that's a very high area, and that's why it is the biggest component for this actual material. So now that we've broken down the cost for gasoline as a whole, after looking at the crude oil and all the major factors, we're going to go into the fixed and variable costs. Fixed and variable costs can be very different depending on the type of business and the operation a company chooses. An oil refinery's production cost will not be the same as a distributor, a retail cost, or anything along those lines. There's very different prices and different costs. Possible variable costs, the short-term rental, equipment, hourly wages, workers, prices of raw materials, unplanned accidents and emergencies, fuel, transportation. Now, when we go to our fixed cost, which is your regulatory compliance, workers with long-term contracts, heavy equipment, land, salaries, energy for the buildings, equipment, maintenance, rent, and legal fees. Those are your different breakdowns of your fixed and variable costs. And as you look in this actual slide, there's the definition of a variable cost and a fixed cost to give you a little bit more understanding of how those differ and how that affects the gasoline industry. Both fixed and variable costs can be relatively predictable for oil and gasoline production companies, especially if they have been in business for a long time. Gas retail prices, however, fluctuate wildly and do not always reflect the production costs, making a point that the wildly changing market prices are not always the result of the wild production cost changes. The graph shows the price fluctuation from 2010 through 2019. Gas prices were affected by the following macro events: the BP oil spill in 2010, the end of the Iraq War in 2011 causes the price to increase due to the increase in demand and the reduction of the sources of raw material. Then we have the Congress deciding to lift the ban of oil in 2015, causing the increase in domestic supply and price decrease, even lowering the price almost $1 less per gallon in 2016. Then we have in 2018, the purpose of this particular event that took place, it increased the demand for prices and they achieved a temporary success. Then finally, the rise for a very successful Texas oil production company in 2018 caused a price decrease. And this is kind of demonstrated throughout the fluctuation map or the fluctuation graph on this particular slide. So you can look at it to see how that has changed over the years. Now that we've looked at the demand of gasoline, went into the production of how gasoline is made, what is all in that, and then we finally look at the cost and what is all put into the actual cost for gasoline, we're going to end our presentation with the profitability of the gasoline market over the years. Gasoline profitability varies depending on the company, the production, the sales, and everything, etc. As we all know, it just depends on your buying, selling, demand, and supply. Retailers make about 2 cents per gallon in profit. Stores typically make about $100 a day selling gas. Profit margins vary widely throughout the years. According to oil refinery industry profitability ratio data, their gross margin for the first quarter of 2019 was 12.41%. This is a huge jump because their last quarter of 2018 was 5.93. That is an insane amount to jump from literally just a quarter, 3 months if that. We can see that even a bad year for refineries actually still has a profit and has a very good profit than most stores. And it's still much higher than any individual retail store or a distributor. So now that we've looked at the demand for gasoline over the past 10 years, we've looked at the production of how gasoline is made, we went into the cost, what's all added into the cost, and finally looked at the profitability and how that changes even through a quarter. I hope that you guys understand that the gasoline industry is very complex, it's competitive, it's ever-changing, and it's a very difficult industry to control, if you could even think that you can control it. This is one of the most difficult industries to understand, and it is extremely impacted by all the world macro events.